Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's wonderful to have you. This is a colloquium session for the IMO organization, where today we have guest speaker, Felix Brandt. He's going to speak about coordinating charitable donations. We're really excited to have him join. And as usual, we encourage you to leave questions in the chat as the presentation unfolds. We are going to have a few minutes to discuss and to have a conversation by the end of the session. Don't hesitate to contact us and to participate. We are excited to have you, Felix, and the floor is yours.
All right. So thanks very much for the kind introduction. So I'm really happy to talk to this new audience for me. So I hope I have something interesting to present to you. So what I'm going to talk about is a relatively new and exciting research area, which is sometimes called donor coordination. And it lies at the intersection of social choice, fair division, and mechanism design. So therefore, I would think that for this community, it has some potential of interest. So what I personally particularly like about this line of research is that I think it has potential for real-world applications, and at the same time, it's mathematically quite challenging. So as a caveat, so I'm a theorist, so I don't have any professional experience with real-world charitable giving, except that I sometimes do it. But yeah, so let me just start the presentation by showing you a couple of papers among which the presentation is based. So I'm not giving you like the conference versions of these, so I try to give you a high-level overview of the results that we had here. So the main reason for showing this is to show you the names of my co-authors and collaborators with whom I worked on these topics, and also to let you see the conferences where I presented this work and where we submitted these papers. So I guess some people in the audience are familiar with ACMEC and WINE, and this is the work, the conferences where we usually submit this work to. All right, so let's start with an illustration of an application of the model that we have in mind. So consider a set of agents and a set of charities, and assume that each agent has set aside a budget to support charitable activities, which they distribute on the charities of their liking. So two reasonable additional assumptions in this model are that first, donors have preferences over charities, or more generally, they have preferences over how money should be distributed among charities. And secondly, donors receive utility from any contribution to a charity, no matter where it comes from. So it doesn't need to be their own contribution. They are just happy the more money is put on a charity of their liking. So based on these assumptions, donors can be better off by taking into account the contributions of the other agents when distributing their own contribution. So for example, in this figure here, if we assume that the utility functions or the preferences of the donors are defined such that, for instance, the first donor here is indifferent between any money that is contributed to the blue charity or the red charity, and the second donor here is indifferent between these three charities here, then these two donors would be better off by spending more money on the red charity because they both benefit from each other's contribution, right? So this is basically one utility model that I'm discussing. So I will focus on two different utility models in this presentation. And it turns out that in this allocation, so now the thickness of these arrows denotes how much money is put to each, or is forwarded to each of the charities. So now the first donor is not contributing anything to the first charity, but everything to the second one. And for instance, the second donor here is not contributing anything anymore to the purple charity here, but is distributing his contribution evenly between the red and the yellow charity. So this, I guess I can go back and forth. So this actually leads to more utility if utility is defined, as I just told you, for each of the donors. So everybody is better off if they were able to coordinate their donations in this particular way. All right. So now for the other utility model, let's consider charities which have a different mission or purpose. So in such a setting, utility functions could, for example, be defined such that donors want money to be evenly spent on the charities that they support, right? So or formally, and this is what we are going to do later, we want to specify that donors want to maximize the minimum amount that any of the liked charities receive. Okay, so for example, here the first donor likes to protect animals and also to provide shelter. And then the utility of this donor is the minimum amount of money that is contributed to any of these two charities here. Now, in this setting, utility can be increased by letting agents spend more money on charities that only they support, because the charities of mutual interest will be funded by several agents. So here again, we can redistribute the contributions of the individual agents. So for instance, this first agent now puts a larger fraction of his contribution on this charity which protects animals and only a smaller fraction on providing shelter, and the other ones have changed as well. And if you compare this closely to the previous spending and you have this utility function in mind that I just informally sketched, you will also see that, again, everybody would be better off. So these introductory examples are really meant to serve the purpose of showing that if the donors were able to coordinate, and we will do this by using a mechanism, then we could increase the utility of all of the donors at the same time. So it's a Pareto improvement. So in general, to summarize the model, so the point of departure that we have is that donors have preferences over how money should be distributed among the charities. And by taking into account this information, we can turn this entire thing into a problem of collective decision making. So here we envision a setting in which there's a central authority which collects the contributions and the preferences of the agents and then spends the money in an efficient or otherwise socially desirable way. Okay. Now, we also have like a variant of this setting, which I will sometimes mention. And in this variant, the central authority only collects the preferences, but not the money from the agent. And then what the central authority does is to issue recommendations on how the donors should spend their money based on the preferences that they submitted to this mechanism infrastructure. But the infrastructure in this case is not collecting the money. And then they receive the recommendations on how they should spend their money. And as you can imagine, so then the distributions that are actually assigned to the different donors should satisfy certain conditions in order to make this reasonable so that the agents actually follow those recommendations. Okay, so that could be visualized as follows. Okay, so I hope you do get the basic idea of what kind of donor coordination we have in mind here. So I'm going to introduce a formal model in a couple of slides. But before we get there, so let's just mention some potential applications of this. Because I did mention in the beginning, so I do think that this entire stream of research could be applied in the real world, which is not necessarily the case for everything that is being done in mechanism design and in our community in general. So let's look at some concrete applications where I think those mechanisms could be used. So the first one is called 5 per mille. So maybe some of you have heard about this. So this is a program that is run by the Italian Revenue Agency. And their Italian citizens can select one of over 70,000 non-profit organizations of their choice. So they have research organizations, sport organizations, voluntary organizations in general. And then the revenue agency will divert 0.5% of the citizens' income tax to this particular organization. So they can also opt out of this program, and then the state will just keep the money. And here you can already see, I guess, how these mechanisms could be useful, because here the preferences are somewhat restricted in the sense that you can only name a single organization that you like, and then all of your 0.5% is assigned to this organization. But if you were able to specify more fine-grained preferences, so it doesn't need to be extremely complicated utility functions, but it could be something like maybe approving a couple of organizations rather than only a single one. If you were able to approve several organizations and say that you like each of them, then the mechanism infrastructure, which in this case would be the Italian Revenue Agency, could use this information in order to distribute the money in a smarter way. There's also a similar program in Poland, which is called Mechanism 1%, based on the very same idea. And this is quite successful in Poland. It was recently renamed to the Mechanism 1.5% because now they're allocating a larger amount of the income tax. Another example is Amazon Smile that I guess people in this audience might be familiar with. So I've been using it for a while, so it doesn't exist anymore. So the idea of Amazon Smile was that if you order something from Amazon, you can order it from a specific website. I think it was smile.amazon.com. And then you can select one of over 1 million nonprofit organizations, and Amazon donates 0.5% of the customer's purchase price to this organization. So it's of course only a very tiny fraction, especially considering that this is Amazon that we are talking about. But nevertheless, so it's a mechanism where you can specify a charitable organization, and then Amazon is donating a small amount of money to this organization. So, and I think here the idea that we have seems particularly useful because we already have an infrastructure. So Amazon is basically already collecting the preferences of the individual buyers. The preferences are quite restricted in the sense that you can only select one single organization. But since, as I said, it seems fair to assume that customers actually have preferences over allocations to charities and not only favor a single charity. By using this information, for instance, the efficiency of Amazon Smile could potentially be improved. Unfortunately, the program doesn't exist anymore. As you have seen from the dates of the conference publications that I showed in the beginning, so I think one of our first papers on this was published in 21, I think, and in 22 or 23, I contacted two people from Amazon Research and suggested to them that maybe they could improve Amazon Smile by using one of the mechanisms that we have studied in our papers. They said they are going to forward this to people in charge of Amazon Smile, and then a few weeks after that, or a few months after that, Amazon Smile was shut down. Didn't have anything to do with the suggestion, I guess. So it was just that they found, I think they said officially they now have other means to support charitable organizations. So I don't know why they closed it down. But it was relatively successful, I would say. So a total of $400 million was donated using this program. All right, so and then we have these classic employee charity matching programs that you have certainly heard about. So just as an example, I mentioned Microsoft and Apple, where people who work at these companies donate money, and then the company is actually matching these donations by paying the same amount to the same organization. So I guess these also have the potential of increasing economic efficiency by taking into account the preferences that the donors might have over charities. And last but not least, of course, there's private charity by groups of donors. Could be, doesn't even need to be donors who donate to charities. It could be residents of an apartment complex who want to coordinate spending on gardening in a courtyard, or homeowners on a city street who want to coordinate spending on tree care, snow removal, and these kinds of things. So I guess there are lots of potential applications. Okay, so on this slide, I would like to briefly outline 4 different application scenarios because so some of the results are more applicable to certain scenarios than other ones. And I would like to make this explicit because in the beginning it was a bit blurry on how the setting is actually defined. So one can think of a fully centralized setting where the central authority owns the individual contributions, as in the case of Amazon Smile, for example, or Cinque per Mille. So there's no chance for the donors to get the money by themselves. So it's really that the organization has these contributions already. It can collect preferences and then distributes the endowment, which is the sum of all these individual contributions. That's the fully centralized setting. One can also have a centralized setting where the authority collects the preferences and the contributions from the donors, so that the donors transfer the money to the central authority, and they also transfer their preferences, and then the authority distributes the endowment. There's a decentralized setting where the authority only collects preferences, as mentioned in one of the slides at the beginning, and then only advises donors how they should distribute their contributions. So they only give recommendations based on the preferences of all the other donors. And then finally, so I probably don't have enough time today to talk about this, but we also have some new results about a completely decentralized model where there is no central authority at all. And here the idea is that donors just independently distribute their contributions by observing previous donations. So the idea is that we look at dynamic processes over time where donors adapt their spending according to how much money each of the charities receives. And we have certain results there which show that then the spending converges to very nice distributions that have desirable properties. Okay, so these are the 4 application scenarios. And then let me show you the model that we have. So in the model, we have a set of agents denoted by capital N, and small n is the number of agents that we have. We also have a set of M public goods. So in the presentation, just as I did until now, I will just refer to these public goods as charities. But in general, in economics, public goods are defined as non-excludable and non-rivalrous goods, which means the first property means that they are available to everyone, and the second one means that one's person's use doesn't diminish the available to the other ones. So apart from charities, there are lots of other examples of public goods. So it could be national defense or public education, public parks, clean air, street lighting, many things. Okay, and then we have that each agent has a certain contribution denoted CI, which is the amount of money that this agent can contribute to this public good. Again, I will keep talking about money and charities, but in general, so this could be any divisible and homogeneous resource. So apart from money, we could, for instance, also allocate timeshares or probabilities. So this stream of research is quite related to an area called probabilistic social choice. It could also be space, for example, but let's keep talking about money and charities here. All right, so the sum of all these individual contributions is called the endowment. So that's the total amount of money we have available to distribute on the different charities. And then we define an individual distribution, delta I, which is a function that assigns how much of I's contribution each charity receives. Okay, so it's just it's a function that tells us how much of the amount CI is spent on each of these charities. So therefore, of course, all of these individual amounts that are assigned to the different charities have to add up to CI, which is the total amount that that agent I contributes to this. And the set of all distributions of CI is denoted by delta of CI. So it's a useful notation. And our main concern is then how the total endowment is distributed. And this is being done by function delta, which can be seen as the sum of all these individual distributions. So you can have a distribution of the total endowment, so all the money that is available, and then you can either decompose it into individual distributions, or you can say we start with the individual distributions to start with, such that the let's say collective distribution delta is defined as the sum of each of these, and of course they distribute the entire amount C that is available. Okay, I think all of this is straightforward. Let me just complete the model, and then if you have questions, we can take them at this point before I show you some of the results. 2 missing pieces, or maybe just 1 missing piece, I guess, for the model is then, of course, the utility functions, and that's very important. So we assume that each agent receives some utility from the collective distribution delta, and that's just a real valued number that specifies how much the agent likes the collective distribution delta. And it's important here, and this is already captured by this definition here, that agents do not care where the money comes from. So it doesn't make a difference to them whether it's their own money or whether it's somebody else's money. They just like the charities, some more than others maybe, and it doesn't matter where the money actually comes from. So in general, I'm keeping these utility functions undefined at this point, and then for the results that I'm going to show you, we will look at restricted sets of utility functions. Okay, so so this notation here is just for defining a set of admissible utility functions from which the agents basically can choose from. And so that's the last piece, and perhaps the most important one for the model is that we need distribution rules. Those will be denoted by F. That's in some sense the mechanism. So the mechanism or the distribution rule maps a utility profile to the individual distributions. So one distribution of each agent's contribution And in many cases, we will only be interested in the collective distribution, and therefore we will sometimes just refer to delta, which is implicitly returned by f of u because we can just take the sum of all these individual distributions. Okay, so that would be the model that I will be using for the rest of the presentation. Anything unclear here at this point?
So I have one question, Felix. Is there a reason for the endowment to be entirely spent? You mentioned that's an inequality, right? Is it possible to have scenarios where donors don't want to spend all their money?
No, so the premise for this entire setting is that these donors have already set aside this budget, which should go to charities, and so the entire endowment will be spent on the charities. So they don't have any use for that money, at least in this model. So because I'm not sure whether you mean that if the leftover money, could it be of use to the individual agents, or what exactly did you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that answers the question already. I was wondering whether there are some reasons why you would want to have that equality, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going on the next slide. I'm saying a little bit about related research. So one problem that has been studied in detail in economics is how much money agents should spend on public goods in comparison to private goods. So we have completely ignored this problem essentially by just saying everybody has set aside this budget for charitable activities. It's not possible to gain any utility without spending it on those public goods.
Thank you. And then I also see that there's a question from Jay in the chat. Jay, do you prefer to ask that question directly now, or should we keep it for the later discussion?
I think we can keep it for later. It's not a
Sounds
central point anyway. So yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Jay.
Okay, so then let's continue. Yeah, I would also, in the interest of time, try to keep this short here. So there's some related work, especially in economics. There's a huge literature on private provision of public goods, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really about the question of how much you should spend on a public good in comparison to a private good. So therefore, there's a fundamental difference here. And maybe just quickly, one other setting that maybe some of you have heard about is participatory budgeting, and which is also about distributing money on public projects. So there are two major differences here. So it is quite related, but the main differences are that typically in participatory budgeting, we have fixed costs for each of the projects. So we want to, I don't know, build a school, for example, or there are costs associated with these different projects or charities. Whereas in our setting, the charities can take any amount of money. So there's no upper cap or anything. It's really just mostly about the utilities of the individual agents who donate to these organizations. And the other main difference is that in participatory budgeting, there's an exogenous endowment, which is already given, whereas here in our setting, everybody contributes something, and therefore we can define certain axioms that only make sense in this donor coordination world and not so much in the participatory budgeting setting. Okay, having said that, so let's look at some desirable properties that we would like mechanisms to satisfy. I guess like at least two of them are quite familiar to you already. So the first one is that the collective distribution that is returned should be efficient. Okay, so it should be efficient, which is just Pareto efficiency in the sense that there is no other distribution which gives at least as much utility to all of the agents and strictly more utility to at least one agent. Okay, so the examples in the beginning were examples of inefficient distributions, and then by using coordination, we could make the distribution efficient. So one distribution rule, for example, that is efficient is the utilitarian rule, which just maximizes the weighted sum of the individual utilities. And so this is like one of the default examples for efficient rules. It has a couple of drawbacks. For example, yeah, so agents will be basically forced to spend money on projects that they don't like in particular, just in order to increase the social welfare. And also, agents are actually in many cases better off by lying about their utility function. So it's not best for them to be truthful. So this is similar to scoring rules in social choice, for example. There are many examples where you're actually better off by by misstating your utility function in order to increase your utility. So the second axiom that we would like to be satisfied is strategy-proofness, just for that reason. And I guess that's also something that you have heard about many times. So it just means that there should be no misrepresentation of your utility function. So let's just fix all the utility functions except the one of agent I. Agent I can misrepresent her preferences to UI prime. And then by this misrepresentation, the utility of agent I should not increase. So the utilitarian rule is an example of a rule which is not strategy proof. An example of a strategy proof rule are dictatorial rules, which in this setting correspond to rules where delta just maximizes the utility of one specific agent. So this agent is fixed right from the beginning, and yeah, so the outcome of the mechanism just depends on this particular agent. And of course, these rules would also be considered unfair because many agents will be forced to either spend their money or their money will be spent on charities that they don't really like. And therefore, we have another third property, which means that the individual distributions delta I, so the collective distribution, as I said, could be decomposed in those individual distributions. And these individual distributions of everybody's contribution should form a Nash equilibrium. And that means that if you would not want to redistribute your own contribution, given that the other agents spend their contributions as their delta I's say. Okay, so if we fix the individual distributions of the other agents, it should be optimally to spend my money according to my delta I individual distribution and not redistribute my own money. So it's a property of individual distributions. Formally, it's defined as follows. We just say that if we here basically what we are doing here is we are subtracting delta I. So we are taking the collective distribution. We are removing the distribution of player I and replacing it with delta I star, which is a new distribution for player I. And this should be so this delta I star should maximize the utility of the agent. And the basic or the main idea of this property is that if you think about settings where the authority just issues recommendations, as I earlier mentioned, then of course we want these recommendations to be followed. And if the individual distributions do not form a Nash equilibrium, it means that somebody can just distribute her own money in a different way, which increases her utility. So she is very likely not to follow this recommendation. So it's like almost like a minimal assumption for this recommendation-based setting there. And at the same time, it rules out very crude things like dictatorial rules, for instance, where the entire endowment is spent on the favorite charity of one particular agent, because, well, the other agents would not, that would clearly not be a Nash equilibrium because the other agents would not be willing to spend their money on this other organization. So it turns out that these equilibrium distributions exist under quite general conditions. So this goes back to very classic results in economic theory. In particular, there's a theorem by De Breu where he showed that for continuous and quasi-concave utility functions, an equilibrium always exists. Okay, so now let me show you some examples of utility functions. So as you can imagine, there are many ways to define utility functions over distributions. So here are some common examples. So the way to look at these figures here is that we assume for these figures here that we have three charities. And then, for instance, so this could be, let's say this is charity A, this is charity B, and this is charity C. And then every point in this simplex here corresponds to a distribution of the entire endowment to these different charities. And now these red and blue lines are the indifference curves. So where red is more preferred than blue. So for example, if you have a linear utility function, this agent here prefers this charity the most. So that would, I guess, here correspond to utility 2, for example, for this linear utility function. And then this agent is indifferent between all the distributions on this line here. So which is to put everything on charity B or to to split the endowment 50-50 between charity A and charity C. So these are indifference lines here. And a special case of linear utilities is the one where you only assume that the utility values that you assign to the different charities can be 0 or 1. I probably don't talk about this interesting special case in today's presentation. I will focus on linear utilities and Leontief utilities, because it turns out that for linear utilities, there are mostly negative results, whereas for Leontief utilities, which we argue make a lot of sense in this particular setting, we had surprisingly positive results, so to our own surprise. So one thing that you can already see here, that with Leontief utilities and also Cobb-Douglas and these like norm-based disutility functions, you can actually have a distribution, like a non-degenerate distribution, which is the most favorite of yours. So for instance, here, this corresponds to a distribution of, I think, 1/2, 1/3, and 1/6 on these 3 different charities. That's the most favorite distribution of this particular agent. And then we have these indifference curves here in the shapes of triangles according to these Leontief preferences. All right, but so let's start with linear utilities. So formally, they are defined by just attaching a weight or value to each of the charities, and then the utility of the agent is then the linear combination of the amounts given to each charity with the weights as coefficients here. So you could also say it's the dot product of the value vector and the distribution vector. And the underlying idea is that charities are substitutes with constant marginal rates of substitution. So for instance, if you assign the same utility to 2 different charities, you don't care at all on how money is distributed among these 2 charities. So here's a simple example. So I will use these kinds of examples also in the rest of the presentation. So here we have 2 agents, and we have 3 different charities, A, B, and C. And the first agent contributes 1, let's say $1 or €1. The second one contributes 1 as well. So the total endowment is 2. And these gray boxes here specify the preferences of each of the 2 agents. So the gray box means that this agent assigns a value or weight of 1 to charity A and a weight of 0 to charity C. Okay, so in this example, we have so-called dichotomous preferences, where you just like some charities and you dislike other ones. Okay, so the first agent likes A and B, doesn't like C, and the second agent likes B and C and doesn't like A. It's a simple case of linear utilities. Now, you could just have what we sometimes call the uncoordinated rule, where just each of the agent independently spends her individual contribution. For example, in this case, because the first agent is indifferent between A and B, she splits her contribution equally between A and B. So this contribution of 1 is split equally, so 1/2 on A and 1/2 on B, and the other agent does the same thing with B and C. Then the collective distribution is this one here, and we have the following utilities for the agent. So the first agent gets a utility of 1.5 because, well, she likes A and B, so that's 1 plus 0.5, and therefore she gets 1.5, and the other one gets 1.5 as well, right? And I'm just showing you this example because here this distribution is clearly not efficient according to these utility functions, because one thing that we can do is by using a mechanism, for example, we can spend the entire endowment on charity B, which is this charity of mutual interest, and then this increases the utility of both of the agents to 2, well, because they are indifferent. So the first one here, for example, is indifferent between A and B, and now he can also benefit from more contribution to charity B, which he likes as well. So this would be an example of a Pareto improvement. Okay, so unfortunately, it turns out that for linear utilities, as I mentioned earlier, results are quite negative for these 3 different axioms or properties that I mentioned. First, there's a classic theorem in probabilistic social choice, which entails for this setting that only dictatorial rules satisfy strategyproofness and efficiency. Okay, so that means for 2 of these axioms, only very undesirable rules remain. And of course, these dictatorial rules do not return equilibrium distributions. So it's only 2 of these axioms are then satisfied. The other thing is that it's relatively easy to show that unique equilibrium distributions can be inefficient. For this, let me show you this example here, where now the dark gray boxes correspond to charities which the agents like more than the light gray ones. So let's say the utility is 1.5 for A here. It's again utility 1 for B for the first agent. And then the unique equilibrium distribution is for the first agent to put everything on A and for the second agent to put everything on C. So for any other distribution, they would want to redistribute. And that gives a utility of 1.5 to each of the agents. And that's inefficient because if they would put both on the charity B of mutual interest here, then the utilities would both increase here. They both have a higher utility. So this essentially is a prisoner's dilemma in disguise. So because many of you are also familiar with game theory, so this is really essentially a prisoner's dilemma, which shows that the equilibrium property and Pareto efficiency don't go together. So even these two axioms are incompatible. And then as another negative result, when agents have unique top-ranked charities, which could be the case for linear preferences, then only the uncoordinated rule, which I mentioned earlier, is anonymous, which means it doesn't make the outcome doesn't depend on the identities of the different agents. Unanimous, which is another weak condition, and a strategy proof. So another negative result, which shows that for linear utilities, there's not much you can do. It turns out that for the special case of dichotomous utilities, where you just assign value 0 and 1 to the different charities, there are somewhat more positive results. And maybe you have heard about a mechanism called CUT, which is the conditional utilitarian rule, or the Nash product rule is certainly something that I think some of you have heard about. So these satisfy some of the properties that I just mentioned, but it turns out that still all three of the axioms, so the equilibrium property, efficiency, and strategy proofness, remain incompatible. And that is an impossibility theorem that we did a couple of years ago with the help of a computer. So it was very difficult to prove, and it solves an open problem that was stated by Bogomolnoyer, Moulin, and Stong in 2005. But that's not part of today's presentation. So if you're interested in the dichotomous case, you can see a YouTube presentation of this other result for dichotomous preferences. But for the remaining time, I would like to show you some positive results for the Leontief utility case. So for Leontief utilities, the utility function is defined as follows. So first, for those of you who have never heard about Leontief, so Leontief is an economist, quite a famous one actually. So he won the Nobel Prize in economic sciences in 1973, and 4 of his doctorate students also received the Nobel Prize, which I find quite impressive. So I think Arrow has a similar track record. But yeah, let's look at the utility functions here. And maybe at first, for simplicity, let's just assume that all these VIs, or the values that the agent attaches to the different charities, are just 1. So then this just boils down to the minimum that is spent to each of the charities. So here, that means that an agent wants money to be evenly distributed among all the charities. Okay, so that is really just the minimum of all these delta x's. Now, if some of these VIs are actually 0, well, then those are ruled out, and then we just have some charities that the agent likes and some that the agent dislikes, and then the agent wants money to be evenly spent on the charities that she likes. Okay, so it could be maybe 2 or 3 charities, and then she wants this the minimum amount of money that any of these charity receives to be maximal. And now, even more generally, so those values don't need to be 0 and 1. So we could assign any value. So we can express our preferences among the different charities, for example, by having a 2 or 3 there. And then we just essentially take the weighted minimum here, where we are just dividing the number by the value here. And this, for example, is the case for this representation, where we have 3 charities. And here the values are, I think, 1, 2, and 3 for the different charities. And then we get the corresponding indifference curves for the Leontief utility function. Okay, so and the basic difference, or the main difference to linear utilities, is that charities in this setting are complements rather than substitutes. it's similar to it's different from the example that I showed you before, where somebody can be completely indifferent between two different charities and doesn't care how money is distributed among them. Here we have preferences over how money should be distributed among the charities. And for example, we can even specify an ideal distribution as we have here, which would be then the one that gives us highest utility. And then the further we go away from this ideal distribution, the less utility we get from this. And now the main result in this paper for Leontief preferences is that we were able to show that for each utility profile, we have a unique equilibrium. And so I showed you earlier that existence holds under quite general conditions, but for Leontief utility functions, it's unique. And this equilibrium can be found by just maximizing the Nash product of the individual utility functions. And therefore, this equilibrium is also efficient. And this connection here is somewhat surprising, and because here we are talking about a Nash equilibrium, and here we are talking about Nash welfare. But these concepts don't have much in common except that they were both proposed by John Nash. You could say we have this Nash meets Nash result here because the unique Nash equilibrium is also something which maximizes the Nash welfare here. And of course, based on this result here, it seems natural to define a rule which returns this Nash equilibrium distribution based on the individual utility functions that were submitted. And this is exactly what we are doing. And it turns out that this rule, we call it EDR, the equilibrium distribution rule, could also be called the Nash product rule, because in this case, they are both the same. And it has very desirable properties. But before I get there, let me show you a simple example here now for the Leontief utility functions. Again, first agent likes A and B, not in the sense that she's indifferent between A and B, but she wants money to be evenly distributed between A and B. Second agent likes B and C. Now the contribution is 1.5. And now the unique equilibrium distribution is here, where the first agent puts 2/3 of her contribution on A and 1/3 on B. And the second agent puts 1/3 of her contribution on B and 2/3 on C. That results in this collective distribution and the following utilities for the different agents. And that's the only equilibrium here. You can see that nobody would want to deviate. If you can redistribute your individual distribution here, you would only get less utility than before, not more. All right, so to motivate Leontief utilities, I would like to give you another example and especially use it to compare it to, for example, the linear utilities we had before. And that's an example from healthcare, where we have a setting where we have one charity which supports patients with some common disease. That's charity A. And then we have lots of other charities, 10 of them, B1 to B10, which supports patients with some rare disease. Okay, and then the preferences of the agents could look as follows. So we have also 10 agents and 11 charities here. So each of the agents likes the charity that supports the common disease, or that tries to fight the common disease more, and therefore assigns more utility to these dark gray boxes and less utility to the light gray ones. So it's like each agent has like a specific charity that she personally is interested in, but she doesn't think it's as important as this common charity here. Okay, and the contributions of each of the agents are 30 in this example. Now, if this were a linear utility function, then of course, like everybody would be best off in the sense of an equilibrium by putting all the money on charity A. So that's the unique equilibrium for linear utilities. Everybody just puts their money on the charity that they like best, and that would result in the following collective distribution here. But now let's move on to Leontief utilities. If we interpret these gray boxes as the values for Leontief utility functions, and we look at the uncoordinated rule, where just each agent independently, we don't have a mechanism here, each agent independently just distributes her money in order to maximize her own Leontief utility, then so the first agent would put 20 out of her 30 on A and 10 on B, because if you recall the utility function here, so this is we have weight 2 for this and weight 1 for this. So what this first agent wants to maximize is the minimum of the amount on A divided by 2 and the amount on B1. Okay, and that means that the utility that the agent gets for this individual distribution here will be exactly 10. Okay, because we divide 20 by 2. But of course, the collective distribution is the following here, where out of the total endowment of 300, 200 are put on this common charity or common disease charity A, and then just 10s are put on each of these smaller charities. Now let's look at the equilibrium distribution rule, what EDR would do. If we again have these Leontief utilities, what EDR would do, it would recommend to each of the donors to put out of their 30, 25 on the charity that are the one on the small charity that they like. So B1 for the first one, B2 for the second one, and only 5 on this charity that supports the common disease. And the reason for this is that this gives the following collective distribution here, which is 50 on A and 25 on each of the smaller ones. And now if you think about the utility functions that each of these agents have, it's again, for instance, for the first agent, it's the total amount of money on A divided by, so it's the minimum of the total amount of money that goes to A divided by 2 and the amount of money that goes to B1. Okay, so the utility for each of the agents here would then be 25 in the unique equilibrium distribution. And of course, it's easy to see that this distribution is also closer to what the agents had in mind if they have these Leontief utility functions, because they want charity A to receive twice as much money as each of these individual charities, and which is exactly what the unique equilibrium distribution achieves in the example here. All right, so let's mention some of the other positive properties of this rule. So as I said, in the case of linear utilities and even for dichotomous utilities, we have trade-offs to make between efficiency, strategy-proofness, and this equilibrium property. And those trade-offs vanish in the case of Leontief utilities because the EDR rule satisfies all of these properties at the same time. First off, it's group strategy proof, which is quite remarkable because for those of you who are familiar with the Nash product rule, which is usually used for fair division and private good settings, so the Nash product rule is usually not strategy proof. So it's well known for being manipulable, but in this public good setting with Leontief preferences, the Nash product rule, which is identical to the equilibrium distribution rule here, is not only strategy proof, but even group strategy proof. From a computer science perspective, it's also interesting to see that the equilibrium has rational values, which is also something that the Nash product rule doesn't give in general. So for other settings, for instance, even if you have dichotomous utilities in our donor coordination setting and compute the Nash product rule, which has been done in some papers, it turns out that the resulting distribution can consist of irrational numbers. So that means we need convex programming to actually compute these numbers, and we cannot really compute them, we can only approximate them. That's not the case here. So the resulting distribution is always rational valued, and it can be computed exactly in polynomial time using convex programming and the separation oracle. Then here we have some monotonicity properties that are somewhat desirable. So for example, if an agent increases her contribution, then it turns out that in the unique equilibrium, the funding of no charity decreases. Okay, so it's the money is distributed in a new way, but not in a way such that one charity receives less than it did before. And if an agent increases the weight for a charity, so that means this agent likes the charity more than he or she did before, then the funding of this charity also cannot decrease. So this is like a monotonicity, like a natural monotonicity type property, which seems quite simple and desirable, but it turns out again that for dichotomous utilities, the Nash product rule violates not only this property, but also the other property here. Finally, on the positive side here, so in a more recent paper that was published at EC, we were able to show that this equilibrium distribution rule can be axiomatically characterized. So it does not only satisfy desirable properties, but if you take the properties of group strategy proofness, core fair share, so which is like a fairness condition, which is based on the core, a solution concept from game theory, and continuity, which is just a technical assumption, which basically means that little changes in the inputs also result in little changes in the output. So if we take these three properties, then EDR is the only rule that satisfies all of these three properties. All right, so let's see. I have some more results for binary weights. So if these weights that we assign to the different charities are just 0 or 1, so there are some additional positive results for EDR. In particular, we can even compute it using linear programming. But let me skip this next couple of things and move to the summary, because I guess I'm almost finished with my time. So let me summarize of what I just told you about donor coordination. So I hopefully convinced you that donor coordination can increase the efficiency of charitable giving. So in different kinds of utility models. So this is the case for linear or dichotomous utilities, but also for Leontief utilities. In general, for linear utilities, results are mostly negative. For dichotomous utilities, there is some interesting literature. Mostly it's two rules that stand out, the conditional utilitarian rule called CUT and the Nash product rule, but none of these rules satisfy all three of the properties: efficiency, strategyproofness, and equilibrium. And for Leontief utilities, this EDR rule, which I just defined, satisfies not only those three properties, but also additional desirable properties. For example, we also have like a natural spending dynamic where agents just update their individual distributions over time, and we were able to show that this converges to the unique equilibrium distribution. And then, so this is something that economists have asked us several times. So there's also another utility model, which you have seen on this figure where I showed you utility functions. They're called Cobb-Douglas utility functions. You could think of them that like being in between linear and Leontief utilities, and some of the results that we have also extend to these kinds of utility functions, but some other results unfortunately break down. Okay, so I guess that's all I should say at this point. So I'm very happy to ask any questions you might to answer any questions you might have. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Felix. That was a very, very interesting presentation. I think we covered a lot of ground, so hopefully there's going to be some discussion. Maybe we can start with the question that Jay left in the chat. Jay, do you want to ask that out loud?
Sure. No, I was just remarking, I think in your examples early on, Amazon and others had no choice of, I think you could only list one charity, and you could only, even the amount that you gave is sort of fixed ahead of time. It seemed like you didn't have any control. I was wondering if the reason to do that is just to make things easier on the part of the participant to not have to make any decisions. It's sort of just doing this one click, and yeah.
That could certainly be the case. So I can only speculate because I haven't talked to anybody who was in charge of Amazon Smile. But in general, I think that's a very interesting question, because you did refer to this as the cognitive burden, because that's a discussion I sometimes had with especially economists, because if you look at the results, the classic results in economic theory about these kinds of mechanisms in somewhat similar and related settings, they usually make very general assumptions about utility functions. So for instance, utility functions can be, I don't know, they maybe continuous and concave, and that's all the assumptions that they make. And under these assumptions, you usually can only prove very negative results. So for example, efficiency and strategyproofness immediately clash if you have these general types of utility functions. And apart from these negative results, I think that what sometimes these economists are overlooking, and what is more common in computer science, is to also take into account the cognitive burden and really think about this as a mechanism where we want people to specify their utility functions. So if you say that you can specify a concave and continuous utility function, maybe by drawing it somewhere, nobody would be able to do this precisely. So that's why I think dichotomous preferences, the study of which was basically initiated by Hervé Moulin and Anna Vogelmann-Neuer in a series of papers, are quite interesting, because almost everybody, so people understand what dichotomous preferences are. You can prove any number of projects that you like and you disapprove other ones. And of course, they are quite restricted because they are only dichotomous. But I think there's a trade-off between how rich you want preferences to be and how much cognitive burden you can put on the agents when they need to specify the utility functions if you want to actually use these mechanisms.
Right.
So even if you have linear utilities, so which basically are von Neumann-Morgenstern utilities over lotteries or distributions of money, like in our case, I would say that most people would not be able to specify these linear utility functions and specify von Neumann-Morgenstern utilities if they want to express their preferences over lotteries.
Right. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Austin, do you want to just unmute yourself and ask?
Sure. I had a question. So we live in a polarized environment. So charities for one, maybe evil for others. So what happens when you care that some don't have money? Like you'd be willing to lie or whatever, anything you want.
That's a good question. So I guess you mean something like having negative utilities for some charities, right? So it's like in fair division, you sometimes have these settings where you're not only distributing goods but also chores,
right?
And you're making distinction between these. So I'm not sure exactly what happens there. So it's of course. But let me think about it. So because if
it's kind of the extreme substitute case, substitute is you would rather have this. Now it's like you would not only do you want this more, you also want the other.
That's true. I guess the only thing I can say at this point, so that's not something that is captured in our model, and results will change, I guess, if you change the model in this way. But it's an interesting perspective. So it's because when we started this work, I was always thinking about charities as organizations that everybody perceives as positive.
Oh, yeah.
But of course, so I once had a discussion with Dominic Peters, who's a co-author of some of the papers here, and he was also associated with the effective altruism community, and he mentioned some things to me where for instance, people, so you can think of organizations that sound like charitable organizations, but that are completely unacceptable to some people, that donate to an extremist party, for example, or something like this.
I mean, non-profit is broad. So,
yes, that's true. It's an interesting question, but I don't have a good answer to it.
I had another question, but maybe I'll let other people ask.
Thank you, Stan. I just want to mention that we're getting close to the hour, so I just want to acknowledge that in case anybody has to leave. Once again, Felix, thank you so much. And if you have some more time, I think that a few of us would love to stay and have a chat with you and try to go over some more questions. This is just to say that the official time of the colloquium has now ended. So thank you so much for joining. And if there's more time, let's continue the conversation. I see that Scott has a question.
Oh, sorry, just trying to applaud. Thanks, Felix. This is great.
Oh, that's perfect. So then I also have a question, Felix, and this is just to pick on some of the topics that have been touched upon already, but I guess one of the interesting things about the research that you presented is that, when you change the model for the utility function and use these Leontief preferences, you're able to get some nice properties. I'm just wondering whether there's any either empirical evidence or anecdotal evidence that you might have, whether in some settings these type of preferences might be more representative than others, and how to think about that particular distinction.
Again, a great question. So it's the only thing I can say about this is that one of our co-authors, Iris Egal-Halevi, was also particularly interested, or still is interested in that question. So, and he ran some early experiments with human subjects at his university in order to get some insight on what preferences are. But yeah, so it's too early really to tell, and I also have to admit that so I think it's really difficult to run these experiments in the right and correct way. So I'm a bit reluctant at this point because as a theorist, I'm not really someone who knows the right tools and how these things should be run. But therefore, I think maybe it would be better if somebody else who has experience with this and knows how, because it's really important for these things how you phrase questions and what kind of examples you give the person, so what the money is actually used for. Yeah, but this is really an important question because as you have seen in the presentation, so depending on different preference models, you can get very different results. And yeah, it's not clear which kind of preferences human subjects would actually have. But it's so again, this comes back to the original question because if we narrow down of the set of potential utility functions by defining the rules of how agents can actually specify the preferences, it's probably not really about specifying the real preferences or utility functions, but by making them comfortable with a system where they, for instance, can only approve charities and disapprove other ones, or maybe specify utilities in a somewhat more fine-grained way. But I guess we are not really talking about mechanisms where you can specify arbitrary preferences over distributions. So it's yeah, so it's I guess there's two coins to this side. So you want preferences to be expressive, but at the same time you also want you don't want the infrastructure or the website or however these agents are then using these mechanisms to be overly complicated.
That makes sense. Thank you so much, Felix. I don't know if we have any other questions for Felix.
I have, sorry, Augustine, go ahead.
Oh, mine was actually just this. I mean, charity on their own and have efficiency constraints. So, for instance, it might be more efficient to have a single charity coordinating a lot of effort, having fundraising effort that are amortized, and it's quite known. It's typically more efficient to donate to big charities. So, I'm just wondering, is there any way where the allocation could be reflecting or telling us whether or not we are going in the direction of not just pleasing people in terms of what is distributed, but actually being efficient downstream? Is there any way to think about that?
Yeah, so I guess these are all aspects that are not really in our model at this point. And also we just wanted to keep the model as simple as possible. So we were just focusing on the perspective of the donors and their utility functions. But of course, you can have also, you could define like properties that are defined in terms of the charities themselves. So for example, whether it's beneficial for charities to merge into new charities, which makes them perhaps more popular. Or maybe I think the only thing that slightly goes in this direction is this monotonicity property that I mentioned on one of the last slides, where I say that if a charity becomes more popular, it should also receive more money. So this is something that is from the perspective that is defined from the perspective of a charity, and it sounds like an extremely minimal and easy to satisfy condition. But in some of the settings that I didn't talk about today, it turns out that this is quite hard to satisfy, surprisingly.
Okay.
Yeah, but of course, there are many things you could do. For instance, also a common question is whether so this assumption that charities can take any amount of money, and of course you could define caps as well, and it's but that will of course then also affect the theoretical results that we have.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the talk.
You're welcome.
So I had a couple of questions, but more on the theory side of things. So you had, I guess, let's start with your line here, where EDR satisfies virtually all desirable properties. For Leontief utilities, is there any property that you would like that is not satisfied by this rule?
Yes. So there's one property that we did use in earlier papers on this when we looked at linear and dichotomous utilities, and this property is called contribution incentive compatibility, CIC for short. And here the idea is that an agent has the choice of putting the money into the mechanism such that it is used for charitable activities, or just keeping it to himself and spending the money, for instance, on the charities by himself, or spending it on a private good, for example. So there are some examples which show you that for Leontief utilities, this property cannot be satisfied at all. I'm not even sure whether efficiency was part of that. But for linear and dichotomous preferences, so we had some positive results for the Nash product rule. So the reason why I didn't mention this property here is because once we found this general counterexample, which shows that for Leontief, this property doesn't really make sense, essentially. If you see the example, you will probably agree to that. So we probably thought that, so maybe it's not really the right axiom for this particular setting. But for dichotomous and linear preferences, there were some interesting results for this property. But other than that, so I really do think that this EDR mechanism, so for instance, if you boil it down to these binary utilities where you can just approve and disapprove projects, so it's not dichotomous linear utilities, so it's Leontief utilities with binary weights. You specify which charities you like, and that means you want money to be evenly spent on those. So I think I wouldn't hesitate to recommend it for actual practical use.
Right. Okay. And you mentioned, a characterization result for EDR that, if I recall, had group strategy proofness as one of the axioms. Can that be weakened, you think, or so are there rules that are strategy proof and satisfy continuity and core fair share that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because whenever you have an axiomatic characterization like this one here, so you want to know whether the axioms are independent. So as far as I recall, I think I'm almost sure about this. So we don't know whether continuity is required here, which is nice because it's really just a technical assumption. So I think it's not really a demanding assumption, but it is. At this point, we need it for the proof. And the other thing is we don't know whether group strategy proofness is required or whether just strategy proofness suffices for the characterization. That might be nice. But other than that, so if you just drop core fair share or if you just drop strategy proofness, then there are other mechanisms that satisfy these properties.
Okay. And you mentioned the earlier result, which I have read the paper. This is a computer-assisted proof of the impossibility of... And is that the only proof known still? And, do you see ways of sort of understanding why those properties are not possible to get together in other ways?
That's again a nice question. So let me just. So you were talking about this paper here, and this impossibility result. So see whether I have something in my notes here. Yeah. So the proof of this impossibility of this incompatibility of those three axioms is arguing about 386 preference profiles, which were generated by a computer. And interestingly, so we just recently, so it's funny that you asked me now. So just recently we discovered that basically half of these preference profiles can be dropped if we drop a case distinction and assume there's an argument which shows that the proof had two different cases which roughly use the same amount of the same number of preference profiles, and by having a without loss of generality argument, one of these cases can be dropped because it's symmetric to the other one.
I see. Okay.
And we currently have a student who's trying to, apart from this thing which we just discovered by accident, trying to get a shorter proof of this statement. But so maybe if you have seen the paper, you already know about this. So this proof is almost unreadable to humans, which is a bit unfortunate. It also raises interesting questions about proofs in general and computer-aided proofs in particular. We do have a very simple proof of the very same statement if we add additional axioms, in particular anonymity and neutrality. So simple symmetry axioms that charities should be treated in the same way and that agents should be treated in the same way. And then we have just a two-profile proof, which everybody can read in 5 minutes, but it does require these additional axioms.
I see. But in effect, you're saying whenever you have these three, if you're requiring these three properties, so what you're really saying is, I guess mathematically what I'm saying has no content given what you said, which is that somehow anonymity and neutrality are implied by these requirements. Is that?
Okay, yes, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But
So
maybe
except that this anonymity and neutrality, that the simpler proof requires, I think, one charity less or something. So I think
see.
we need at least 4 or 5 charities, depending on which. But this is just a minor detail. Yes,
Right.
but otherwise, yes. So these axioms are not required.
So yeah, I mean, I remember reading the paper and the general ideas, and of course, I didn't have the patience to sort of read through I think you pointed to a place where one can go and check or something like that.
Yes. So we even have an appendix with all the prof rights listed.
Right.
But what is quite funny is that, as I mentioned, this problem was open, and the axioms. So actually, the axioms that we use for the impossibility are much weaker than the ones that I gave today. So it's so the strategy proofness notion that we use for the impossibility is weaker than the one that I defined today, and also the equilibrium property is not really used, but a much weaker property, which just says that everybody should get at least positive utility.
I see.
So the utility should not be 0. So it's
Right.
this property was called positive share by Bogomil, Neuer, Muller, and Storm.
Right.
And the funny thing is, so even if I recall, so even this weaker statement, which uses anonymity and neutrality, so where we got this very simple proof, even that was open before we found the proof. So we also tried to prove it, and so did Bogomil, Neuer, Muller, and Storm. So they tried to find a proof for the statement, didn't succeed. And this 2-profile proof, which just takes a few lines, was also found by a computer.
I see.
And that was somewhat surprising to us, because when the computer then said, so there's a proof, but it only uses 2 profiles, then we said, okay, there must be something wrong with the implementation here. So that's impossible. Either we would have found this proof or Heavy Muller, for example. So that's really puzzling. And but well, I think it uses 5 or 6 charities or something, and there's a lot of profiles if you have these high numbers. So therefore, nobody found it before.
Yeah. Very, very nice. Thank you. Thank you for all of these comments.
Sure, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Felix, and thank you so much, Jay, for all the questions as well. I don't know if there are any other questions, or we can just close the session. I know that we've already taken more time than we asked for, Felix. So once again, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. So I had a good time.
Bye.
Perfect. Thank you. See you around.